In our post-October 7th world, are you seeking to connect more deeply with your Jewish heritage? Are you a mom with kids at camp, looking to spend a week, or even 3, immersed in Torah? A Torah teacher seeking a summer of in-depth learning in Yerushalayim? Or maybe an entrepreneur, eager to explore the Jewish laws of business in detail? No matter your stage of life, Nishmat's Summer Beit Midrash is the place for you. This program offers transformative Torah learning for women of all backgrounds in the heart of Jerusalem. Visit nishmat.net/summer-beit-midrash to learn more. That's nishmat, nishmat.net/summer-beit-midrash. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Nishmat's Summer Beit Midrash. Change your life, change the future of Am Yisrael.
Was Israel's war necessary? Both from a legal and a moral, because everybody wants to do moral construct. Absolutely, it was necessary. It has nothing to do about justice. That's not what I found on the ground is the reasons that this is happening. The goals of the war aren't because there needs to be justice. The goals of the war to return the hostages that were legally taken in accordance with the laws of war, to remove the political power that invaded my country and did this massacre, and make sure that they never have the ability to wage war and threaten my nation again. Those are all just in all shared definitions, and they have nothing to do with revenge, justice, or anything else.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is The Orthodox Conundrum. This is The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. We celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, this Thursday. Yet this celebration will be tempered by the knowledge that the war against Hamas continues, as Hamas is still holding 59 innocent hostages, of whom 24 are assumed to be alive. And despite the obvious fact that Israel is justified in fighting against Hamas, we continue to hear loud and often blatantly anti-Semitic claims that Israel is committing war crimes and even engaged in a genocide of the Palestinian population. It seems therefore like an opportune moment to speak with Colonel John Spencer. Apart from being an award-winning scholar, professor, author, combat veteran, national security and military analyst, and one of the world's leading experts on urban warfare, he has been a vocal defender of Israel's actions over the past 19 months, saying, as you'll hear in this interview, that he's not pro-Israel per se, but pro-truth. 2 weeks ago, Colonel Spencer appeared on Piers Morgan show to debate comedian Dave Smith, who himself debated Douglas Murray on the Joe Rogan Experience a few days prior to that. In this conversation, Colonel Spencer talks about some of Dave Smith's arguments against Israel and explains why they don't hold water. He also explains some of the intricacies of international law, the nature of urban warfare, the definition of genocide, how the number of casualties is often misused, and how these facts relate to Israel's war against Hamas. We talked about morality in war, the ways in which people make mistaken assumptions about the nature of war, and how logic and morality relate to the Geneva Conventions. And we also discussed to what degree the current war can be seen as successful, and what Israel needs to do to end the war and avoid its becoming a quagmire. It was a fascinating discussion, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you, our listeners, to find out what you think. We'll get to our conversation in a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Colonel John Spencer is the chair of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point and host of the Urban Warfare Project podcast. A globally recognized expert on urban warfare and military strategy, he is a combat veteran with over 25 years of service in the U.S. Army, to include commanding forces in 2 tours in Iraq. Spencer is the author of 3 influential books, including Understanding Urban Warfare, Connected Soldiers, and the internationally translated Mini Manual for the Urban Defender, which was widely used by Ukrainian civilians in 2022. His analysis has appeared in the New York Times, CNN, and other major outlets, and he currently serves as a colonel in the California State Guard, where he leads urban warfare training for military units and civilian agencies. Colonel John Spencer, thank you for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
You've gone on the record, Colonel Spencer, as saying that Israel's conduct in this war against Hamas has been historically good for urban warfare in terms of innocent civilians killed while trying to kill terrorists. Can you explain briefly the international law as it really stands in this case and what Israel has done that has been in accordance or not in accordance with that international law?
Oh, let's start with an easy one. So, it's trying to explain the whole body of work that is the international law of armed conflict, the laws of war, is difficult. But for example, some of the fundamental principles of the laws of war, like do not target civilians. There is the military law of necessity, the law of proportionality. And really, from the beginning of October 7th, we have, because we live in a global information world, everybody wants their information immediately. We had people misconstruing the laws of war and Israel's conduct post October 7th, like that element of proportionality, which is the one I like to explain because it's really the one of the primary ones that people just seem to get wrong. Some from just not knowing what the law is or purposely trying to misconstrue it. So the law of proportionality is about whatever the operation, strike, or whatever, there has to be an assessment of the concrete military value of a target or operation or something compared against what would be the known or suspected collateral damage. And the value and the collateral damage can't be excessive to that concrete military objective. Plus, so there's a calculation of, okay, what is the value of the target versus what is known to be the collateral damage, not just the death of non-combatants, but also the damage, the collateral damage of infrastructure and destruction of homes and things like that. But there's also a clause in the proportionality assessment that even if you make that assessment, ensuring that it's not excessive, you also take all reasonable and feasible means to reduce the collateral damage, because the laws of war ultimately are what kind of as a global community in an evolution, we have tried to put the limits to the brutality of war so that the persons that are not receiving the overwhelming cost of it, being the civilians who aren't a part of the armed conflict. But that reasonable and feasible. So one is, so going back to your question about the IDF and why do I say that Israel has gone above and beyond the legal requirements, right? So what we call the legal obligations of like that proportionality is to do the assessment, right? To calculate what is the value. So in this war, post October 7th, against the objectives of the Israel based on being invaded and then waging war against the invader, the attacker, of October 7th, Hamas, both the political and military organization. And then what did they do? So they do these assessments. And then what did they do? And this has been my other writings, that Israel has done more than any other military in the history of war to take those reasonable, feasible, innovative approaches to limit the harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure, despite, in this case, the aggressor, the enemy, doing everything it can to get its own population killed.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, because
Sure.
the way you're describing this international law, taking all means to try and limit civilian casualties, etc., it sounds almost by definition subjective, such that anybody can claim any conflict is violating international law by that standard. Since there can't be an internationally accepted standard, every case is different. If I'm a general in the Israeli army, I can claim that a certain commander in Hamas must absolutely be eliminated. And at the same time, somebody else could say, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. That was not necessary. So doesn't that open up a huge can of worms?
To some, it might seem as such. I will say that the law of war is always qualitative, not quantitative, right? So, on the opposite of this conversation, we've had people try to say, like, well, look at the number. Of course, I don't care what you say about what this framework that had been evolved and everything. But where I'll point out is that context absolutely is calculated in the law of armed conflict, right? So, whether it's in what we call a internationally armed conflict, two nation states versus each other, or non-internationally armed conflict, which accounts for like non-state actors, to include those that don't even follow the laws of war. And then what is adjudicated and what are the kind of agreed upon frameworks where in that example you just gave me of like a Hamas commander, it would be assessed by kind of a collective assessment of what did the commander know beforehand, what is the value of the target in context to the overall war, right? So this is really has come to light in even in Israel's operations in Hamas, where people have, like New York Times, try to compare it to pre-October 7th calculations, right? Where if you're in a counter-terrorist operation, like Israel was during the ceasefires against Hamas, but still while they're plotting, where the framework of, okay, now you're in a counter-terrorist operation, not in war. What is the realm of what a kind of collective, reasonable, informed adjudicator, expert, or whatever would say, okay, this is appropriate under the context of the operation. But where you take it into a war, where the goal is the destruction of the removal of power of Hamas, the destruction of its military, where the value of that Hamas commander would be assessed reasonably as of a very significant concrete military advantage to the goals of the war, which are viewed collectively, and I think most people will, a just war, right? So Israel absolutely had the right to defend itself and to go on a defensive war against Hamas and then pursue it justly, which it gets into the laws of war. So you have kind of legal, moral, ethical, and all these frameworks intermix, and it's really hard for people to understand. But it's not, I would say, completely subjective. No, because we would assess each action, whether it's a commander or the military or the individual conducting the operation, what did they know? How did they account for these kind of boundaries on brutality, and the laws of war are a part of that? And then what steps did it take to ensure? And this is, I think, where people get lost in what we call effects-based condemnation, right? So even in your scenario, they'd be like, look at what the despite all you're saying, the effects, the number of civilians or non-combatants, the amount of destruction and all that. And this is where, again, the people just don't know. The law doesn't work post facto. It's not the number that matters. It's what did that commander in your scenario know? What was the target? What did they do? What munitions did they use? What time of attack? What precautions did they take? Like evacuating civilians, like Israel has done every day since October 8th, given precaution, notifications, and then the means to try to get civilians out of harm's way, get them from not being used as human shields and human sacrifice that Hamas uses them for.
I still think, though, and I agree with everything you're saying, so I'm coming on the same side as you are, but numbers have to play some role. I'll give you an example. Let's say Israel said, well, the best way to get rid of all the Hamas commanders is simply to nuke Gaza. Imagine that were feasible, and kill 2 million Gazans, and therefore that's the best way to get rid of Hamas. I'm sure most people would say that's a massive violation of international law and a crime against humanity and a moral monstrosity to simply say the most efficient way to get rid of all of Hamas is to get rid of all the civilians as well. Again, not at all acceptable, so numbers must matter, right?
Numbers do matter, and you're making the moral argument of the greater good, right? Where that calculation comes into effect, right? Which is, and there are plenty of examples like the dropping of the nuclear bombs instead of doing a ground invasion into mainland Japan. But where I'm saying the numbers aren't the overriding sole determinant of legal, moral, ethical conduct. And this is where we've gone, the pendulum has swung. Yes, the numbers like an individual strike, right? So this is where, and this is what Israel and other Western democracies do. They do allow for transparency, for judgment. But what I'm saying is that the world has gone on the fixation of the numbers, which in of themselves need to be questioned on how did you come up with that number? And then understand that the number isn't the determinant. It isn't the sole determinant. Yes, it can be factored, right? So yeah, if you killed 1,000 civilians to get to one person who isn't of a exponential value for the, like if it was the overall commander of an entire nation's military, and that taking that person out would turn the tide of the war, then then yes, it does. The numbers matter in this proportionality assessment. Yes, but they're not in the sole determinant and the in the post facto, right? The number that matters is the number that was known beforehand. And there's lots of examples of why that has to. It has to work before the operation, not after the operation. But you, of course, transparency, this is what democracies do. And we can give lots of examples, even recently, how that really factors into explaining what the military did, knew beforehand. Then you have the fog of war and all this.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Of course, my questions are predicated on what I believe to be the fallacious assumption of some that the numbers in Gaza are extreme. And you are saying they are very much not extreme. I'm working even within that theoretical assumption. I'd like to ask one more question, though, about the context and this idea of immediacy of, you call it the war. I'll give you an example. Let's say, and admittedly, this may not be a technical war situation, but let's use laws of war to talk about 9/11. If the United States government, realizing that the pilot of one of those airliners is about to slam into a skyscraper in New York, they can prevent that by shooting down the plane, even though it might kill several hundred civilians along with the terrorists, but it will be in long term a much better situation than knocking down the World Trade Center. I would assume, most would assume in the laws of war, that would be a valid military target. And you can tell me if I'm wrong or right about that. But along with that, let's say, for example, it's not to prevent them from knocking down the World Trade Center, but it's because you know that terrorist is on that plane, and one day he is going to do something, maybe in 10 years, because he's planning something, but it's not immediate, and that's the only way to get him. My question really is, how much is the immediacy of the situation a factor in determining whether something is legal in international law? And the reason I'm asking specifically is because a lot of the calculation which Israel is making now is to make sure October 7th never happens again. It's not about what's going to happen during this war or ending this war so much as ensuring that Hamas cannot rise again to perpetrate another October 7th. Can you respond to that?
Sure. And these are some interesting, deep questions. Absolutely, immediacy and a time factor factors into the laws of war, like military necessity, proportionality, distinction, right? Only targeting military targets. But really, and like I said in the proportionality thing, what it really comes down to is a collective reasonable thought of real concrete military target within the context. But you're always balancing, which the law does account for, and really gets it, this is really hard stuff because it's a human endeavor. This isn't done by robots. It's absolutely done by humans in the most complex endeavor war that you could ever imagine. And it has to be something of reasonable thought, right? That the immediacy, but you're always balancing military necessity with humanitarian concerns under these other principles and thought through. So yes, where immediacy and you could argue like I had to do this immediately, and where it might be a split second decision, and in other reasonable conditions where time, like the value of surprise, right? So putting this back into the world of urban warfare in Gaza, where immediacy would have had you entering Gaza immediately to return the hostages as quickly as possible and to prevent the enemy from forming a better defense immediately, weighing that against the humanitarian concerns to give civilians the precaution to get out of harm's way. So this is what Israel did, right? Israel waited 3 weeks before entering Gaza in pursuit of the hostages because it was balancing military necessity, operational variables, and that humanitarian concern. So in every decision, right, and this is really, you want to be, and it factors in under the actual context of the decision being made. What did you know at that moment? And we have a lot of revisionist history where people want to go back and then question the decision that was made without putting in the context, right? The whole, man walks through fog. When man looks back, the fog is not there when it's assessing other people's decisions.
Okay, we are going to get specifically to Gaza, but I still want to ask one more preliminary question if it's okay.
Sure.
I'm wondering how much an army is allowed, using again the Geneva Conventions and international law, to protect its own soldiers at the expense of civilians. In other words, until now, we've been speaking about targeting combatants and the collateral damage of killing civilians in the process. To what degree must an army protect civilians on the other side, thereby endangering its own soldiers? Is an army allowed to protect its own soldiers, so to speak, at the expense of enemy civilians?
So, I mean, to be frank, civilians could never not be a factor. And this is all the way down from the laws down to what we call rules of engagement, which are beyond the laws within the context of a military's operation, which includes their own national values, the moral, ethical codes in their military. And some people can't distinguish between laws of war and rules of engagement. Absolutely, you can say definitively it's never not a thought, the presence of non-combatants and the overriding, which actually is an evolution, like you said, post Geneva Conventions. Things were done in World War II that wouldn't be done today, like bombing of civilian populations to try to create a condition where they put the onus on the political and military apparatuses that are waging the war. So you're trying to convince them to lose the will to fight by bombing their population. We don't do that anymore. And this is the evolution of the laws that people need to understand. But within that context, you're saying kind of like the right of self-defense, right? So you're putting your soldiers like the element of surprise, right? By announcing that you're coming, I argue that you're actually giving the enemy overwhelming advantage by taking away what we teach in war colleges. The main element is surprise, but you have to balance that with the humanitarian concerns in a dense urban environment. And yes, there is a kind of inherent ownership to the military who has the kind of the ownership of the use of force to take on a sense of risk to their own selves, but it's mitigated, right? So this is the tough balance. Absolutely, you could argue that the IDF has absolutely taken great risk to its soldiers out of humanitarian concerns, but that's what moral, ethical, professional militaries do. And then then we can get engage on how far it's gone in assuming that risk to your soldiers. But there is an inherent evolution in the laws of war, which do evolve to, yes, the military will take on a risk to itself out of concern for exponential, excessive civilian harm. And I account for that. And it's there. What you never want to do, though, is take the self-defense rule away from a soldier. As a former soldier myself, the soldier always has the right of self-defense. So when they're being attacked, they can return and defend themselves. But in these, especially in planning, what really matters in the planning of operations, absolutely, there you account for that risk to yourself, but then you mitigate it through other means.
Okay, now let's move over, Colonel Spencer, to Israel and Hamas specifically and what's going on right now in Gaza. And I know that you've said that Israel is not only dealing with a situation of urban warfare, but an extremely complicated, perhaps in an unprecedented manner, version of urban warfare. Can you explain that, please?
Sure. So there's many domains to the challenge of urban warfare and why it's the hardest, most complex environment for any military to do any operation, let alone. But what Hamas built was something that what I argue has no historical comparisons, right? Because just from the variable of the government, Hamas as a government and as a military, using their civilians as not just shields against attack, but sacrifice in their political strategy. They state and act in every way that they need the death of their own population to achieve their political goals in the war and in their grand strategy, which is the destruction of Israel. In the war, kind of my realm, they say they need and they act in a way to get their civilians killed. That's very unique in urban warfare history. Plenty of enemy forces like Al Qaeda, ISIS, and others have used human shields to protect themselves against attack. But I can't find where they've used human sacrifice of their own population. We could go to World War II and talk about how the Japanese would sacrifice other people's populations, like in the Philippines, but not their own population. So that factor is a factor, and that translates to military objectives because Hamas built a very unique urban environment where they put all of the military capabilities underneath the civilians in 400 plus miles of tunnels ranging from just underneath most buildings to over 200 feet underground. That creates a very unique challenge where there's tunnels all around the world, and the tunnels aren't new in warfare, but putting them under the civilians for the sole purpose of using the civilians as your kind of political strategy for the war, which is for the international community to turn on Israel in this pursuit of its political objectives. The war is always a contest of will. So, in this urban environment, what Hamas has created is very unique. I mean, the density of the urban terrain is it. I can find parallels. The presence of tunnels, but not at this scale and for this purpose. And then also the international context to the war. Urban war, war is the pursuit of political goals. It's always fought within what we call this, this trinity of the will of the military, the politicians, and the people, but not just the people within the war, geopolitical, every population. And what we saw was that the world was observing, and what they thought was happening because of this interconnected world wasn't meeting the reality of what I've researched on the ground of what the IDF were doing. And lastly, which makes it very unique for warfare, to have a non-combatant population. Because I don't, I try to talk in military terms of combatant, those partaking in the hostilities, and non-combatants, those that are protected. I mean, some people talk about civilians. I want to talk about non-combatants because you can be a civilian that turns yourself into combatant really easy. In this context, in Gaza, why the IDF faced something that few militaries ever face is that there was no way, because of Egypt, refusal to allow refugees to leave Gaza, to get the civilians completely out of the main combat areas. Of course, Israel attempted to move them to like the Al Mawasi humanitarian zone, and then would announce where their main objectives would be. Again, accepting risk to themselves, telling the enemy where you're going to be. These all add up to the most complex, toughest urban warfare scenario that any military has faced in the modern era, and arguably in any era.
And just on a technical level, is anybody wearing a uniform a combatant in that definition? Meaning, let's say there's a combat medic. Is he considered a combatant?
Absolutely a combat medic. You're right. That adds on to this fact that it's not just the fact that Hamas will not wear a uniform, intentionally tries to blend in with their population, but Hamas has built an entire environment of using the laws of war that the IDF follows against them. So not distinguishing themselves as combatants so that they can count anybody who's dead as a civilian, weaponizing all the protected buildings, which has been the evolution of war, right? The hospitals, the mosques, the schools, the fact that Hamas uses them as for military purposes in violations of the law of war, not called out in the battle of the narratives, but absolutely it makes it more difficult to execute the operation when Hamas is intentionally using its populations, using the laws of war against the IDF, and trying to blend in to make it harder, more complex to fight the war, for the war to be viewed as just, for it to continue.
And that's certainly part of their tactics. That's what they're trying to do, unfortunately, somewhat successfully vis-a-vis the international community. I would say, Colonel Spencer, that in international public relations, in public opinion, conventional wisdom, there are, at least from what I see, two different complaints or charges against the IDF right now. One of them is that the IDF is violating the laws of war. And despite what you've said, people will say there are war crimes. That's like the ICC sending out arrest warrants for Bibi Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And then there's a second charge, which I heard recently when you were on Piers Morgan. Dave Smith challenged you by saying we need to forget about the technical rules and look at logic and morality, and the facts just don't align with that. And even if technically Israel is following the laws of international warfare, they're violating the tenets of logic and morality. Tying everything you've said until now together, could you answer those two charges and explain why that's simply not true on either level, either in terms of international law or in terms of morality and logic?
Sure. So on the first one, there is, despite the political theater that has evolved in these United Nations groups, to include the ICJ and the ICC, which have historically have well documented anti-Israel bias. Just and you would think that a what we call an objective legal body would exclude itself if it has a history of bias, as in the actual individual members of whether it's an investigative team or a court of jurisdiction. And that's the big problem, is that you can't argue that Israel is violating the laws of armed conflict and then misapply the actual assessment methodology jurisdictions of the structures in which we're talking about. So, like the ICJ, which didn't rule on anything that Israel was actually doing, it ruled on South Africa's ability to bring a case to the ICJ. And then that was misconstrued globally. And I think the ownership is on the ICJ to argue that no, but it's been used globally as some type of validation for the claims, ridiculous, baseless, in my opinion, based on my research, claims of genocide. But that's an example. Now, the ICC and its arrest warrants, again, for Israeli, where it doesn't have jurisdiction. So just by the start of it, I believe in the laws of war. I believe in hearing and investigating on what we call war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. I believe in all of that. But we can't create a structure to get individuals accountable for the and then say, well, we don't, the Rome statute and the jurisdiction laws, in this case, we don't think they apply. We want to go after these individuals. And then we don't want to conduct the investigations, because I believe so many people try to put me in the pro-Israel camp. I'm actually in the largest camp of pro-truth and pro how things we have all agreed upon work. So the problem with the first claim of violating the laws of war is that the people that are saying this are misconstruing the laws of war, don't want to have an argument on the actual evidence versus the claim versus the reporting of that. Like the ICC's investigative process that did not go to Israel and collect its own investigation. We can't get into the details about what it actually says on statements from political leaders, intent versus actions, and then going into that whole thing we started with, like, where did you get your numbers? Where are you getting your data, which you're saying is evidence? And so I think they're baseless based on my understanding and other experts in the laws of war and the complexities of this war. The second claim, which is, unfortunately, we live in a world where anybody can have an opinion, but then they try to have their own facts and they try to spin really convincing narratives of, like, I don't care about what the laws of war say. I'm making a plea to logic and morality. One, that is such an uninformed position to believe that after centuries, literally centuries of warfare and war and the creation of nation states and the evolutions of the law of war, which are centuries old, that account for morality, right? So this is the ideal of I'm trying to make an argument towards morality that killing in war is wrong. If you kill somebody in a domestic setting, that's considered murder. Just because you've developed some other social construct in war, it's not. Like, just by the framing of that statement, it shows a complete inability or laziness or ignorance to the history of humans and the history of the thought of global or just war theory, right? The ideal that our laws, both civil and war, doesn't account for morality is ignorance. Morality in of itself is a construct, whether it's religious, cultural, legal, whatever. It accounts for right and wrong. And in war, absolutely, we have accounted for what is right and wrong, to include when killing is necessary. And then how it is intentionality accounted for, just like we've been talking about. What does the law of war say about collateral damage or the non-combatant deaths? It counts for all of that. So both claims, one is baseless, the other one is just ignorance.
I was speaking to a close friend of mine in preparation for our conversation today, Colonel Spencer, and he was arguing, this is a rabbi, he was arguing that based on not just Jewish philosophy, but also general philosophy, that a big problem and mistake that people make is not understanding that when a country or a terrorist organization, whatever you want to call Gaza and Hamas, invades another country, the normal laws of morality that apply in a society where those laws are broadly accepted simply don't work anymore. And they have to have different rules. In other words, the rules of warfare are by definition for an abnormal situation. When I am in a society where there are laws, even if the person who robs my house doesn't accept those laws, society accepts them. But when we're dealing with two different societies, one of which accepts the fact that they are allowed to rape, pillage, and invade, and the other one doesn't, to say that we have to follow the rules of our morality as if they are in a normal society which does accept that, or at least the government accepts that, is to allow that morality to be a weapon used against us.
Yeah, most normal people understand. But to say that morality isn't a social construct is ignorance. And it's throwing out years of theology, philosophy, even within the rules of war, or even within criminal jurisprudence. The ideal of like we have murder is a social construct. It's biblical. Thou shalt not murder. But there are. It's just so frustrating that that's the position somebody wants to take, and they can't see. We call it Dunning Kruger, right? When you don't know that you don't know enough to be making these statements. So you're like literally blinded by your own ignorance. You haven't done the jurisprudence. This individual, this comedian with this massive following, thinks he's like Immanuel Kant or Thomas Aquinas, and he hasn't done the due diligence to actually read these statements to know that how ignorant a statement about morality can be.
Well, when he was on Joe Rogan, one of his arguments was, as I understand it, that the appeal to authority, which people will generally do when it comes to deep moral questions, can't apply here because authorities have been lying to us and misguiding us for too long. How would you respond to that?
I mean, I think that's the straw man that these people use, right? There's just so many layers of problems with the logic, right? So logic, morality, the logic of, well, because we were lied to, I don't know who we are, because these people got it wrong, we should not trust any expert in any field of science, right? This is where I get, whether it's Bloom's taxonomy and like, I want to have an opinion on nuclear fusion, but I don't know anything about it, but I have the right to have an opinion about it. I don't agree with an appeal to authority, but the same people who say you can't make an appeal to authority are actually doing it themselves. And if you listen to that one individual, he does it himself. I make an appeal to actual thought, right? Knowledge and foundational actual information about a topic in which you're talking about. You can have I use it as a catchphrase, but for me, just as a human in society where opinions can't become facts, they can be questioned, their logic can be pulled apart, the string of putting evidence together, data together to form an opinion. Anybody can have an opinion, but not everybody can have their own facts. And if you want to have an opinion about a subject, do your due diligence, whether if it's an individual event or if it's a complete body of work like the morality of war, then do your homework. So it's just insane. And I think it's about and I agree, it's much more right. COVID, so many people got it wrong, but you can't take that event in history and throw out all this other. What is an expert? How do you obtain knowledge? How do you understand what, like, I love Bloom's taxonomy just because it's like, okay, you got to have a foundation in order to be able to start analyzing an event. We live in this world where these people can everybody can do their own type of research. They can come up with their own conclusions based on all of that work, but you can't be lazy and just start and then not expect your assertions to be questioned, which is what we're doing in this case. But this appeal, this anti-expert, don't trust institutions, credentialism is bad, like all this stuff is rubbish.
And you make a very good point when you say that they're not really doing research and not trusting authority. They're just choosing a different authority to trust who may or may not be an actual authority. It's not as though the people who are saying do your own research are spending years and years in labs trying to figure it out, which would be a valid way of discovering something. Instead, they're saying, well, I found this guy on YouTube who says differently from all the other experts, and I think I'll follow him. What they call research is just laziness on social media, I think.
Absolutely. Then you get into conspiracy theory, there's some damage done in the COVID anti-institution. They lied to us. And then, as Dave Smith does, Iraq War, they lied to us without, and Douglas tried to do this. Like, you looking back at history, and this is the danger, which I think beyond this ridiculous claim of I'm making an appeal to logic and morality, and you're making an appeal to legality or expert, credentials. Like, it's like logic is the questioning of your rationale and your veracity of your assertions. But what we see now is these people who are being used as credible sources are practicing revisionist history. They're going back and finding tidbits of information and then really creatively and convincingly telling a narrative that they view as unquestionable. Look, this is why this happened. Look, I found this bit of information, and then fast forwarding with this narrative. That for me is the big danger of also people like Dave Smith, is that this revisionist history convincing narrative that, again, not saying everybody's lazy, but it sounds convincing, like, oh, I'll go with that. And then I'm going to start trusting this person, whatever he says. Every claim, to include my own, question how I attained that information, how I came to my analysis, conclusion, or assertion about it. It's not a plea to expertise, although there's in expertise, right? I'm not going to go to a bum on the street for brain surgery. There is something to professional standards, barriers to entry, right? Because you have to demonstrate you have a foundational knowledge of a topic, whether it's brain surgery or being a soldier, right? We don't give every person who joins the military the ability to do lethal force without first going through a body of training and education under command, all these things. So it's so anti intellectual. It's so like, this is what I told this individual: you can be anti-war. I'm not going to allow you to be anti-factual. Like, yeah, if you hate all war, got it. But this is the other thing with the Dave Smith, is that his morality isn't also ironclad of all killing is bad. He actually says, I see the thought of terrorists, right? If you kill my family, I'm going to want to come kill yours. I see the rationale of Osama bin Laden. I see the rationale of Hamas. Like, how the heck do you have that? How's that logical morality, that all killing of any non-combatant is bad? But if I'm a terrorist, I kind of see, and it works. So I understand that morality.
So let's talk about some of those specific facts now in the current war. I'm going to quote something by Kathleen Parker of the Washington Post, who's a columnist who I actually respect very much. I like her. She wrote this on March 28th. It was part of an opinion piece. And this is the quote: "One may quibble with the language, though the killing of 50,000 Palestinians in Gaza, mostly civilians, does resemble genocide. Many who support Israel's right to defend itself might view its mission of extracting justice as disproportionate retribution." Again, this is someone I respect. I was somewhat shaken by her statement that she was calling it at least approaching genocide. Admittedly, she did follow that with the line, "Still, there's no quibbling over Hamas's refusal to release the remaining hostages, living and dead, to end the war." So she's not necessarily stating an opinion, but even discussing and using that G word, genocide, as something which is admissible, as something that's real, was something that shook me a little bit. Not because I think it's true, but because I respect her opinion and was surprised she would use that. You have been very, very clear in this interview and in others that there is no genocide going on. I'd like to understand why that's true and how you know that's true, given, number one, we don't even know what the casualty figures are. Hamas themselves lie about the casualty figures, and people on the street and on campuses are now throwing out a brand new number in addition to Hamas's 50,000, without distinguishing between civilians and combatants. Now people are starting to talk about 300,000 people killed in Gaza. Absurd. Nevertheless, without any clear knowledge of the numbers, how can we argue that this is not a genocide?
So I understand you value that person's opinion, but by just that one statement, I would question her ability to come to an opinion, right? So again, you can have your own opinion, you can't have your own facts, even though if you're picking facts out of the so just the use of the word genocide, right? So then you get to question, okay, you use that word, define it, right? In the internationally accepted definition of genocide, which was created to describe the Holocaust. I mean, the worst intentional eradication of an entire race. And then it has further definition, culture, all these other things. And then it has very prescriptive actions that will lead somebody to the conclusion that that's the intent of the action being taken, whether it's a military operation or even internal operations. It's not a genocide because the intent to eradicate the population of Gaza isn't there. And I know that from my own research, but also available actions of the IDF in the execution of the operations, not only in what it's doing to target the combatants, but what it's doing to separate, despite what Hamas is doing, its non-combatants. Right? If this is, I had this argument with Ken Roth about like siege warfare. If Israel's intent is to genocide the Gazan population, they're the worst genocider who's ever attempted it, right? By feeding the population, by moving the civilians, by stopping operations every day of the war to allow civilians to get out, by never targeting civilians. All the evidence is overwhelming that the intent of the military, even that, so the only time they've ever had it, they'll take political statements that have been made by certain political leaders versus the actual orders, right? So genocide has a history of how did he prove in cases, whether it's during the Holocaust or even like in other areas of war, how did you prove there was intent to eradicate a certain population, your cultural, all of these things? It's sometimes it's through military orders, right? So it's not what it's through the actual orders given to the military. And by every level of the IDS operation in Gaza, that's not there, and not in their actions, not in their orders, not in their intent. Every day, not in one statement, but in every day of the operation, it's not there. But the other bit of information, which I would question this person's statement about genocide, one is the definition of it and the presence of the criteria outlined, accepted by everybody who's a signatory to the Geneva Convention or the Genocide Convention. I'm sorry. The criteria is not present, right? All the actions required to say, even if I can't prove intent, I can show through actions that you're doing it, which has to be collectively assessed. The other thing about the 50 Palestinians, right? So this is the 50,000, that a number, like it doesn't matter, right? This is where I rail against this idea too. Like even if the number was 100% true, like we had 50,000 bodies, let's not even go into combatant, non-combatant, and that equals genocide. It is anti-intellectual. It's not how the construct of the use of the term works, not in the social structure or even the definition of it. There is no number that says, I don't care what you say, John, about all that other stuff, about the criteria that is defined to equal genocide, or all the stuff you say that Israel has done to prevent civilian death. Look at the number. That's a really bad world. And if you even know they validated cases of actual genocide, one of those is a very low number of deaths. It isn't the number that says, well, I don't care. This is the number of deaths in this war equal genocide, right? And this is where I don't like to play the statistical game, but I can show you horrible death tolls in wars, even post World War II, like the Korean War, right? 2 million civilians died in the Korean War. That's 54,000 civilians a month for 37 months of that war. Nobody was saying, well, that's genocide, because the number isn't the determinant of legal, moral, ethical conduct. So whoever just made that quote, is so inaccurate in the construction of that assertion that it's hard to argue because there's so many errors in the logic and the structure in which she's using the terms, and even justice, right? So this is, again, just war, justice. What is the goal of the war? What is the ethical conduct of why is the war happening, right? So I did this article recently on, was Israel's war necessary, both from a legal and a moral, because everybody wants to do moral construct. Absolutely, it was necessary. It has nothing to do about justice. And that's not what I found on the ground is the reasons that this is happening. The goals of the war aren't because there needs to be justice. The goals of the war to return the hostages that were legally taken in accordance with the laws of war, to remove the political power that invaded my country and did this massacre, and make sure that they never have the ability to wage war and threaten my nation again. Those are all just in all shared definitions, and they have nothing to do with revenge, justice, or anything else. There is a bit of deterrence, right? So there does have to be consequences to war. So I will argue there is a bit of deterrence, right? You can't allow Hamas or any other group in any other part of the world to do this massacre in violation of all international norms and international laws of conflict and say, yeah, but the death toll to do anything about it would be too much. So there can be no justice, there can be no consequences. That's a really ugly world as well.
Okay, I'd like to ask you, apart from morality and international law, in terms of military success, how would you assess Israel and the IDF's success over the past 18 and a half months, not only in Gaza, but also vis-a-vis the entire Iranian axis?
Ooh, that's a big one. So so that's the military strategy. War is the pursuit of political goals. So Israel has been very effective, despite all that we've talked about and the complexities of the war in Gaza in itself. And like you said, you want to ask me about the kind of the Islamic regime of Iran, Ring of Fire axis that Israel has changed the Middle East by its execution of its operations, not just against Hamas, but also Hezbollah, Syria, Houthis, you name it. But in Gaza itself, let's start there. Israel has been very effective at dismantling Hamas's military. Hamas doesn't have a military today. Hamas has a guerrilla force with lots of radicalized fighters willing to die for their cause. Got it. From a military strategy assessment of the war goals to dismantle Hamas's military, Israel has been very successful at that at a low cost to themselves. And then you could argue, okay, what are the other costs? But just from a military assessment, successful. But that does not mean that they will achieve their ultimate war goal. Goals can be defined of removing Hamas from political power because that takes a different strategy. But from the Hamas started with this massive military with combat power, weapons supplies, rocket supplies, 24 battalions under 5 brigades, ability to do large scale invasions like October 7th. It doesn't have that military today. It has a guerrilla force with small arms, with very little capability to do any type of military action. Now, but there's still the goal of removing Hamas from power, and that's a much longer conversation of what it will take to do that. But you asked for the military assessment of the IDF in the last 18 months. So the IDF was able to reestablish deterrence against Hezbollah, to completely eradicate its leadership. It's in complete hierarchy of military leadership within a matter of weeks. Reestablish psychological deterrence, take away Hamas and Hezbollah's strategic capabilities of rockets. So Hezbollah's strategic supply of rockets, ability to threaten northern Israel, was destroyed within weeks. But it also rippled across the fall of the Assad regime, another terrorist regime, because Hezbollah and the Islamic regime in Iran, who also attacked Israel in the last 18 months, didn't have the capability to continue to prop up the Assad regime. So now there is a complete resettling of the Islamic regime of Iran's capabilities, both as a nation state and in all of its proxies, what we call the Ring of Fire around Israel, attempting to pursue its grand strategy. I'm talking about Iran's, to destroy Israel and then come for America next. Israel has been highly successful and done the unthinkable against Hezbollah, against the Islamic regime in Iran, to include demonstrating that the Islamic regime in Iran is highly vulnerable from a military construct because they've spent most of their money on internal rule of the dictatorship of the rule of the Iranian population and its pursuit of nuclear weapons, which they think is the trump card to be able to rule in the Middle East.
Okay, I have a couple follow-ups on that particular question because you talk about how Israel has eliminated the Hezbollah leadership. And of course, that's true with that very well-known cell phone operation, the walkie-talkie operation, various other operations. I've heard some people claim, not military people, but people in the population here in Israel say, well, what does that really do? Not necessarily vis-a-vis Hezbollah, but in general, we took out this commander. It just seems, okay, now there's a new commander to come and replace him. So I'm wondering from a military perspective, how important is it to take out leadership and how much is it more of a temporary Band-Aid, whereas a new person is simply going to come and replace them? It's not really such a solution.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it really gets into, and thankfully I have this foundation and knowledge of teaching and strategy in the military history at West Point to say that combat power, right, of a military is not just the number of soldiers they have, right? We have this fallacy of, I call it the abacus fallacy. They have 100,000 soldiers and you killed one guy, they'll just rise up. No, leadership is one of the qualitative factors in combat leadership. And everybody knows that Hassan Nasrallah was, and what we actually discovered was more of a great power for the Islamic regime than was even believed before October 7th. It's his influence, his value to the Islamic regime in Iran, to Hezbollah, and everything was highly valued. But in the actual, we talk about combat power analysis, when you evaluate leadership, training, weapons, supplies, all these things that add up to what we call relative combat power, the ability to be a military, to do certain things. The elimination of not just Hasran Nasrallah, who this is a very influential figure in the will of Hezbollah, in the power that Hezbollah has in Lebanon, the ability, the connections to the Islamic regime in Iran, very significant from a very measurable kind of metric. But it wasn't just him, right? Israel took out every level of command in Hezbollah, which really gets to the dysfunction. And yes, you could have another guy come up, and they did that. Then Israel would eliminate that person. But you get to a point where there is a kind of quality of leadership, but Israel just didn't target the leadership. Israel targeted the main center of gravity of Hezbollah to attack Israel, which was its rocket supplies that the Islamic regime in Iran had provided for it. And that all leads up to what were the goals against Hezbollah. The goal was not to destroy Hezbollah. So I could argue, yeah, absolutely. Taking out Nasrallah doesn't destroy Hezbollah. Okay, who said the goal for Israel was to destroy Hezbollah? Hezbollah has a state within a state. In order to destroy, like we're talking about, people are, we, as in people analyzing in Gaza, in order to destroy Hamas, you have to enter the terrain. You have to take its coercive power, its weapons to rule the population, and its political power to rule the population. If you wanted to do that in Lebanon against Hezbollah, that would require an operation that the IDF couldn't do. The goal was to reestablish deterrence. So Hezbollah does thinks twice now before sending a single rocket. It's no longer the ping pong that Israel has been under for years, where Hezbollah would send a rocket, Israel would respond to where the rocket came from, and then they would just keep doing it, like we saw with 60 to 80,000 Israelis who didn't were homeless for 18 months because of Hezbollah. That's no longer true. So the goal was different. So when you take in an assessment of what does killing the leadership do, it can't be taken within a single variable. It has to be done collectively against the goal.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So my second follow-up question is about what you said when you said that Hamas as a military is basically gone. However, now it's become a guerrilla fighting force. And one of the things that worries me as someone living in Israel is that, and this is true really for the entire Iranian fundamentalist axis, we are talking about an ideology which is fed by extremist Islamic fundamentalism, where the deaths of huge numbers of civilians is considered a reasonable price to pay if it leads to the elimination of Israel. Therefore, deterrence is very, very difficult, because if they don't care if their population gets killed, they can keep going. And if they don't care that they themselves get killed, they will keep going. I guess my question really is, given that reality that is being fed by this religious extremism, how can the war in Gaza ever actually end? There's never going to be an agreement, I don't think, that Hamas will come to where they say, fine, we're laying down our arms. We accept that we can no longer be in charge and we'll be exiled. Perhaps that will happen, but in all likelihood, they'll fight to the death, meaning to the last fighter. So how can this war ever actually come to a conclusion?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there is plenty of military history to show examples of where it did work, right? So this is the futile comparative analysis of comparing Hamas to terrorist organizations or other insurgents, right? Hamas is not an insurgency. It's a government. It's a military. It's an idea, right? And this gets to the whole counter arguments where you can't destroy an ideal this way. Absolutely, I can, and there's plenty of history to show it. I mean, there's lots of ideals, radical fundamentalist ideals like ISIS and Nazis and all these other elements that don't have power, right? So this gets to an idea of power, right? But you're absolutely right on the extremist fundamental underpinnings of this idea, where it isn't that the death is acceptable. Death is the goal in their ideology, right? I absolutely believe, and people are right to say that unless you occupy, and this is the historical example of, if you want to defeat an idea, one, you have to take away its power, right? So that's political and military power. You have to take the guns away from the actual organization who have these ideals, and then you have to stop the radicalization of the population, right? So this is where the constant flow of reinforcements, right? So this idea that Hamas has the same number of fighters that it did before. Like I could argue on the combat power, like we just did, but you're right. Until you stop the radicalization, it will just continue. Now, how do you do that, right? First step is win the war. So take the political power to have this complete societal construct continuing, right? This radicalization from birth, from literally primary school, right? Palestinian Sesame Street about killing and the death of yourself to kill the Jewish people. There's plenty of post-conflict de-radicalization strategies, but you have to remove the other power, and then you have to be willing to do what's necessary to de-radicalize the population, demilitarize the terrain, and then establish something new. So absolutely the war is possible. I don't believe in this idea you can't defeat an idea. There's plenty of historical examples where you can take the power away from it and it relegates itself down to a very minor ideal. It isn't the societal construct. You have to de-radicalize. But step one is to stop the radicalization that's currently going on.
And my final question, Colonel Spencer, is this. How can Israel avoid this becoming a quagmire? Now, I realize we talk about quagmire, we think of Vietnam. This is extraordinarily different. I'm not trying to compare them. However, there's a certain point where you're playing, as they say, whack-a-mole. You hit one terrorist, then you have to get another terrorist. And as long as there's some terrorists there, despite what you said that there's a way to win the war, ultimately, you're never going to actually be able to finalize and finish the job. So how does Israel avoid this becoming a quagmire that goes on for the next 20 years, if they can?
Yeah, it's a tough question with Gaza, right? Because Gaza is very unique in its history, what has been tried to be as the solution. I personally believe the biggest way that Israel prevents us from being a quagmire is by being willing, right? Just a show of will by not just the political government that's in government right now, but from a nation state to do what's needed to eliminate this autonomous terrorist breeding, the whole construct is just not, it's just a cycle of violence that will continue no matter the solutions that have been tried. So you have to have the willingness to do what's necessary, like the clear, hold, build strategies, like deploying forces there for a very long time, right? Post-World War II, General Eisenhower said it would take 50 years to de-radicalize or denazify the German people. It didn't for many reasons, but by just signaling the willingness to do it, that was a part of winning. Was removing the will of the opposition and creating the quagmire, right? So this is the counterinsurgency. You have the watches, I have the time. They wait you out. There's all these examples. Although there's some very unique aspects to Gaza, Israel as a nation state has to signal to the world, to Hamas, to the Gazan people, that they have the willingness to do what's necessary and the proper strategy to achieve it within the both local and international construct, which is really hard to do, but I think that it is possible, yes.
Colonel John Spencer, for the past year and a half, I've been an admirer from afar listening to you speak, and now I can say I'm an admirer up close. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and I really appreciate you joining me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
In our post-October 7th world, are you seeking to connect more deeply with your Jewish heritage? Are you a mom with kids at camp, looking to spend a week, or even 3, immersed in Torah? A Torah teacher seeking a summer of in-depth learning in Yerushalayim? Or maybe an entrepreneur eager to explore the Jewish laws of business in detail? No matter your stage of life, Nishmat's Summer Beit Midrash is the place for you. This program offers transformative Torah learning for women of all backgrounds in the heart of Jerusalem. Visit nishmat.net/summer-beit-midrash to learn more. That's Nishmat, NISHMAT.net/summer-beit-midrash. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Nishmat's Summer Beit Midrash. Change your life, change the future of Am Yisrael. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.